So, welcome to class 5 of D21UD. In the previous class, class 4, we looked at the modified rational method and how it can be used to design pipes. One of the checks we did in that design was for minimum velocity criteria. Now the minimum velocity, if you remember, is about ensuring the flow regime is such that there's enough energy in the flow to keep solids moving so they don't cause blockages, attract vermin or cause odour problems. That check was pretty much about applying a fixed minimum velocity criteria for every pipe in the network. Now what we're going to talk about this week is how you could do that slightly different. So how you can basically vary that minimum velocity criteria across the network. So this slide here is basically a copy from the previous week's notes where we had an overview of the modified rational method. Sorry, I've skipped slides there. Modified rational method. So as it says there, so normally we'd pick a minimum velocity criteria of 1 meters per second. But the so-called Syria method allows us to vary that. And we'll talk in these slides about why that is and how that works. So rather than a fixed velocity which applies to all pipes, what we have is this chart. So if you like, if we were to draw a line on this chart to represent the fixed velocity for all pipes, it would be a line that looked like this, obviously a bit straighter. Okay, at 1 meters per second for all pipe diameters. Now, what this method allows us to do is in some circumstances pick lower velocity criteria, and in other circumstances to use higher velocity criteria. And as well as that, it also differentiates between different situations where the sediment's being carried. So the SHLOD, that stands for, so it's a storm pipe, you've got a high sediment load, and LOD, which stands for limit of deposition, means there's no deposition. So that's a pipe where there's absolutely no deposition at all. But if we went to the same pipe, but we were willing to allow up to 2% deposition, what you see is that the velocity criteria become quite different. So if we were looking at, say, a 500mm pipe using this method, if we were willing to allow 2% deposition, the minimum velocity criteria could be just 0.8 meters per second. But if we went for keeping it completely clear, the minimum velocity criteria comes way up here. It's probably just over 1.6 meters per second. Now, that difference might just seem like just a number, but why this is important is, remember, is to get those steeper velocities, those higher velocities, the pipes have to be laid at a steeper angle, and steeper angles means, in quite a lot of circumstances, means deeper excavations, which means higher construction costs and higher maintenance costs as well. So there is an advantage to, where you can, to think more inventively to try to use lower velocity criteria, because that saves you money basically. Okay, we'll come back to this chart at the end, so don't worry if you feel I've rushed through that. So sediment is a problem in sewerage systems, and we'll talk about where I think we've talked to some extent where it comes from already. So it comes from the catchment surface, where you've got surface water inputs. So sand, grit, etc., washed off from the catchment surface into the network, and also from domestic and commercial inputs. So you're getting obviously quite a lot of organics there, but there is also some inorganic material that will come into the sediment, into the sewer under those circumstances. This graph here shows the volume of sediment in a line of sewer after it was completely cleaned, and what you see is that in this particular sewer, you've got a steady increase in the amount of sediment. Obviously, there's some dips around rainfall events, etc., particularly here, which might align to these events, but then the build-up does continue. Obviously, this is for this pipe only, for this sewer length only, and it might be that in other circumstances there's no sediment ever in the sewer because you've got good self-cleansing conditions. So sewer sediments are defined as any settleable, it's not easy to say, particle that is found in stormwater or wastewater, which could form a deposit. Normally, solids are classified as in four types. You've got gross solids, which just really means larger particles, grits. So the gross solids are larger particles which have relatively low specific gravity, so that tends to imply they're organic. You've got grits, which are larger particles with high specific gravity, so they're inorganic. You've got suspended material and dissolved material. And it's important to note that all these materials will settle under different hydraulic conditions. So obviously where you've got a specific gravity below 1, it's not going to settle, but for the other particles, they'll settle depending on what the velocity conditions are and what the velocity conditions are. So this really shows you where you would expect sediments to be found in the sewer. So you've got what's called Class A material, which is your consolidated sewer sediment. So that's material that's built up over time and it's starting to gain some strength, because particularly where you've got grits and gravels which have been deposited, they'll amass on the sewer bed, and the organic material will start to build up around them and build within them, and the organic growth, the growth of bacteria, etc., within that will start to give it some strength. And that's important because it means that it makes it harder for the flow to erode that material. It also means that you've got a build-up of pollutants within the sediment bed there. So when it does get eroded, those pollutants are released, and sometimes you can get a lot of flush of pollutants as a result of that. We also have sediments which build up on the pipe walls, biofilms, and these can be significant. Okay. Now the chart on the right is really just to emphasise that, and I think I spoke about it slightly there, is that in a lot of ways you can view particularly when you've got a combined sewer, you can view that as a reactor. So although the sediments go into the sewer and they do have polluting characteristics, that's going to change and evolve as it goes through the sewer. So where you've got aeration happening because you've got fast moving flows, that means there's lots of oxygen in the water, and that helps those processes. So I've shared these pictures previously showing sediments in sewers. These are all in Dundee, and you can see there's a pipe here, we'll come back to this pipe in a second, which is kind of around that diameter. So quite a lot of the diameter there is being consumed by sediment. Now that's quite an unusual situation, and we'll come back to why that is in a couple of slides' time. But this is in Dundee. Historically, I think I explained in an earlier class, is that because Dundee is hills which feed into a relatively flat city centre, the problem we have is the water comes down in pipes, the flow comes down in pipes quite fast into the city centre, and then once we get into the flatter gradients, that flow slows down. So the flow loses energy, can no longer maintain, particularly the grits and gravels, in the flow, either as bed load or suspension, and they are deposited out within the network. And in the past, that did cause problems and increase flood risk, etc. You can't really make it out, but in this picture here, this was in Dundee again, and it was being undertaken at a time when there was construction work nearby. And what had happened is that some of they'd been using concrete on site, and some of the wash off from that concrete, so really water that contained a small amount of cement, was washed into the sewer, and that deposited on top of the sediment bed. So the kind of grey looking material you see here was actually that cement, and what had happened is it formed a crust over the ordinary sediment, and it was basically stopping it from being eroded. So quite an unusual situation, but not entirely unlikely. So this pipe here, where I talked about how so much of the pipe diameter was consumed by sediment. This is from this situation in Dundee, and I spoke about this in previous classes, where you've got the flows going this way, and in the base of the sewer, the Victorians installed these sediment traps. An idea being that as particles came along in the flow path, they would then be deposited in these traps, and it meant that when it come to removing sediments from the sewer, they were all located into these traps. That could be dug out rather than have to dig out whole into sewers. So obviously, this is the lower part of the diagram shows the same sediment trap in plan view. Now, the issue the Victorians had, of course, was to dig out those sediment traps. Men had to get into them. So what they had to do was set up a bypass, and what you see here is the bypass in plan view. So the flow would go around this way, and at either end they would have a gate which was movable, which was basically act like a basic valve to divert the flows. Now, in the picture up here, you see that's the gate there. You can see it's open, and that's the diversion route there going through. The problem here was that the gate had been left open, as you see it, so the flow was going both across the trap and through the bypass. But because the preferential route, if you like, was basically straight through across the trap, only a small amount of flow was going around the bypass, and so that meant the flow was going relatively slowly, and that caused all the sediments to drop out. So quite quickly it just fills up. So biofilm grows on the pipe walls. This is a kind of a picture of it. It captures some of the pollutants from the flow, and it builds up, and it can become quite substantial, not huge, and then once the flow velocity picks up a storm event, it can be eroded off. And there's some work to show that this causes increases in pollutant levels during storm events. The growth of biofilm is huge research, and sewers is a huge research topic in its own right, and understanding the processes which take part in it as well. So here we have another sewer pipe. We've got the same kind of issue where we've got we've got a weir here, where it looks like the flow only goes over that under certain circumstances. So perhaps the flow, so the flow normally goes this way. Because of that, you have this kind of dead zone here, where the flow is not moving very fast, so you get a lot of deposition, and you can see that in the picture there. As well as solid materials, there's also issues with what's called fog in sewers, fats, oils and grease. This is largely a problem here in city centres, where you have lots of cafes and restaurants, and perhaps areas where you have food processing. So the fats, oils and grease end up going down the sinks or drains in these establishments, and then once it gets into the sewer, where it starts to cool down, and it congeals and it can cause blockages. This can be a substantial issue, and most water companies will undertake a lot of work with businesses to try to discourage them from disposing of fats, oils and greases in this way. It can also be a particular issue in where abattoirs discharge to sewerage systems. Now, in the UK, this was made illegal after mad cow disease outbreak in the 1990s, but up until then, it was acceptable for abattoirs to discharge to sewerage systems, and the fats in the blood would then congeal in the sewer and cause blockage problems. But also, what they also did was attracted vermin as well, who would come along and feast on this, which again is a significant issue. So here's a little slide on fat soils in Greece. There are approximately 200,000 sewer blockages throughout the UK every year, and it's estimated that 75% of them involve fat soils in Greece. So quite incredible. Okay, so it's the same story as we spoke about earlier, and this, any loss in capacity of the sewer means that you're more likely to have CS overflows, and you're more likely to have flooding events. And you can see in this picture, it's not you can see there's like a wet wipe or something there as part of the mass, and that's part of the problem with this material. Is it's not just fat soils and grease; it tends to accumulate all sorts of other things within it, which kind of reinforces the strength of it. And once it's established, it's very difficult for the sewer, using its own processes, to move it on. So it tends to be that people have to go in and dig it out at quite significant expense. So different types of sewer sediments and the characteristics of them there. So you can see that you're going from the Class A, remember I talked about earlier, your coarse, loose, granular material having quite a high density, through to your finer grain deposits, which have lower density. Your fat soil and grease, your organic slimes and biofilms, looks like your FOD content is quite high there as well. So different types of sediments in the sewer, completely different characteristics. Obviously, probably the material that's hardest to move is your coarse granular material, but as you can see from here, it's probably the ones which have the lowest pollutant level, but it's the hardest to keep moving. This is this sediment material, but just looking at the different particle size ranges you would expect. So here we have for the coarse Class 8, the coarse granular material. You can see that quite small amount of it is fine, but up to a third of it can be particles between 2 to 5 millimeters in size. And of course, what's interesting is that although the fine material although the fine material is small in size, it does carry those higher pollutant loads, and that's emphasised in the table at the top below, right there. So typically this is how the material moves in a sewer. So this is an inverted egg-shaped sewer, which is relatively common. Victorians were very keen. So what you have at the base is you have your consolidated Class A material. So that's material which may have built up over weeks, months, or perhaps even years. It's strong enough for you to walk on without it giving way very much. Then moving above that is what's called bed load. So the Class A material is going nowhere. That's completely consolidated and it's fixed, and it will only move when you have a storm event. Above that you have the bed load material. So that's material which is entered the sewer system, either by the surface or through domestic or commercial input, and it's moving through the network towards the treatment works. It's bulky and it's heavy, so it's moving towards the bottom of the flow column. But the size of it means that during the night, say, where the flow velocities will start to reduce, it might become deposited, then as the flow velocities pick up again, it will start to move again. It's rolling or it's bouncing along the bed of the sewer. So that's a kind, and this material is perhaps where the highest level pollutants are. And above that, obviously you have the flow column where you have your suspended solids material moving along with toilet tissue, etc. Obviously there's not a strict line that breaks between the two of these because it's shades of grey rather than a binary situation. Yeah. So what happens during storm events? So to the left here we have dry weather flow. So this is like a long section through the pipe which I showed in the previous slide. So we've got dry weather flow on the left there. We've got a Class A sediment, we've got our bed load above that, and then our suspended solids. So what happens is once the flow velocity picks up, because you have flow moved into the sewer, the flow velocity picks up and that causes the bed load material then to enter suspension. At the same time you might also get some erosion of your Class A bed, and that material also may enter suspension. Okay, so it's important to note that this tends to happen towards the start of the storm event. So you've got the flow comes in, the material picks up, and then it moves forward. Now what this means is that, and this doesn't happen in every sewerage system, and there's a lot of debate about the causes, etc. But what happens is at the start of the event, because you get the erosion of the sediment bed, and you've also got the mobilisation of the bed load, is you sometimes do get a pulse in pollutants reaching the treatment works. So you get normal dry weather flow levels, then just at the start of the storm event you might get a pulse of pollutants, then after that you would expect the pollutants to drop right off, because remember your sewage is going from your inflow is being diluted by the rainwater. Another thing that might happen at the start of your rainfall event is you get the wash off. This is slightly separate issue. You get the wash off of solids which have built up on the catchment surface. They get washed off the surface and into your sewer, either your surface drainage or your combined pipe. And again, they might come through towards the start of the event. So it tends to be that the wash off the catchment surface might happen in the first 10 or 15 millimeters of the rainfall event. You get that again. You get this pulse of material moving through. So bed load, we looked at this earlier, I think in week 1 I shared a video with you, and this is the kind of material which will move at bed load, highly organic. You've got fecal matter and also food waste, which you can see there. And again, this is bed load from during the evening, and you can see because the flow velocities are lower overnight, what's moving as bed load is just basically the broken down toilet tissue in a combined sewer. So this chart here looks at the movement of sediments through a combined network. So what you see is we've got the build-up of material on the catchment surface, and hopefully you've got a local authority that's brushing the roads and footpaths to keep them clear where possible. But if that's happening, or if it's not happening properly, then you will get material moving from the catchment surface. It's almost inevitable, along with flows into your gully pots, into your combined network, and then onto treatment, hopefully. Some of that sewage might be removed via sewer cleaning, or if you're unlucky, some of those solids will make their way out via your CSOs and end up straight into the receiving water. Once they get to the treatment works, normally the first stage, well, it depends. One of the first stages of the treatment works is solids removal. So it goes through some sort of screen, some sort of grit removal, and a lot of this material is moved quite easily at the treatment works. So that's great news if your network can get it there, because you've got adequate velocities, etc. But it's what happens upstream that we're really concerned with in this course. So this really looks at the characteristics of the suspended solids in a sewerage system. So you've got suspended solids by mass on the left, and on the right we've got chemical oxygen demand, which is in this context, it's an illustration of how polluted the sewage is. And so what you see is that all those surface solids take up quite a large volume of the suspended solids. In terms of the pollutant load, it's relatively modest. So even during your stormwater event, only 6% of the mass of the sediments might be due to your foul flows, but they'll make up 20% of the pollutant load. This slide just goes through different types and sources of sewer sediments. So you've got your winter gritting and salting. These days, traditionally grit was grit with salt mixed in, but these days grit tends to be predominantly salt. So in terms of particles coming into the drainage network, it's less of a concern than it used to be. You've got materials coming from road surfacing and woodworks. You've got ingress from the surrounding soil through infiltration perhaps, industrial commercial processes. Construction works are recognised as being a significant source of sewer sediments. Construction sites these days have to have processes in place to try to manage the sediments coming from the works. Where there's specific concerns, it's not unusual for vehicles to have to be washed down, etc. before they leave the works. But normally wherever you see a large construction site, when you go past, there's quite a lot of mud on the road just because of the vehicle movements. All that silt material will end up in the sewerage system eventually, well, the sewerage system or the surface water drainage system at some point. Domestic sewage, soil erosion and windblown sand can be a big issue in coastal areas. So it's possible really to break those different types of sewer sediments into three main types. So sanitary, surface and sewer solids. So sanitary solids are the large fecal or organic matter with a specific gravity around 1, so neutrally buoyant. Fine fecal and other organic particles, so food waste perhaps, sanitary refuse, vegetable matter and solid particles from food processing, and materials from industrial and commercial sources. So surface sediments are a bit broader in range. So we've got atmospheric fallout, particles from the erosion of roofing materials, grit from road surfaces and road resurfacing works, de-icing grit particles from motor vehicles, depends on how old your car is I guess and which particles it's leaving on the road. Remember we spoke about this earlier, I mean all the tyre wear in previous classes, all the tyre wear, the brake pad wear etc. ends up on the road surface and it gets washed into the network. Materials from construction works, litter and vegetation etc. From the sewer, that's really about the breakdown in the sewer, so through the ageing of the sewer, materials from in the sewer become part of the problem, if you know what I mean. So or as it says there, soil particles infiltrating through holes in pipe walls and having to be conveyed through the sewer network. So shared these pictures earlier, well certainly the one on the right earlier in the classes, where we were talking about how road works, the silt that produced on the road, and how that's washed into the drainage network. The middle picture shows how this gully, the inlet to the gully has been partially blocked due to vegetation that's been washed off the road. Now, I happen to remember that when this rainfall event occurred, it hadn't rained for a few weeks. Quite an unusual event and quite unusual situation here in Edinburgh. And because of that leads to a build-up of material in the catchment surface. And so it all gets washed down and you get these kind of blockages happening. Picture on the far left is a gully that's just completely blocked and is useless. So I think the whole of Edinburgh, which is a city of several hundreds of thousands of people, they have just two crews of people who go around keeping gullies clear. So it's a really difficult situation for them to manage them all, and a lot of the times it's reactive, meaning that they're basically spending a lot of time going out to where there's known problems rather than being proactive and stopping gullies getting like the one we see on the left here. So remember, the gully's job is to stop the sediments from getting in the sewer, because you've got the settlement area within the gully pot itself, where the particles coming in from the road surface through the gully top should come in, and here's a particle there, nice odd shaped one, should come in and become settled there, and then it's only the flow that makes its way into the network. So you've got the build-up of sediment here, and it's only the flow that makes its way into the drainage network. Okay. Spoke about earlier how these things have to be maintained, so there has to be space for the sediments to fall into. The issue is that a lot of organic material ends up in these things. The gully then becomes a reactor for pollutants. When the rainfall comes in, the gully pot, a lot of the material gets mobilised and it gets washed into the drain and potentially into a watercourse if it's a surface water network, where it can cause problems. So sewer sediments are associated with three basic problems. So blockages, that can lead to surcharging or premature flooding. Loss of capacity, so again, premature surcharging, premature flooding, and perhaps even premature operation of a CSO. And pollutant storage, so I've spoke about how pollutants can build up in the sediment bed or in your gully pots, etc., and they can lead to problems. Spoke about the flushing of pollutants and how that can lead to a spike in materials coming into treatment works, and also gas production. So that's really the odour problems that some residents might complain about. But a secondary issue is that if you have gas building up in your sewer, it makes it harder to maintain because it's not safe for your workforce to go into the sewer if there's gas there. So here's some text for us to look at. So due to the problems which sewer sediments generate, it is normal to attempt to minimise the occurrence of sediments via good design. This is essential as the removal of sediments from sewers can both be costly and disruptive. The need for sewers to be designed to carry sediment has been recognised for many years. We spoke about Victorians, and conventionally this has been done by specifying a minimum self-cleansing flow velocity. Although this approach has apparently been successful in many cases, a single value minimum velocity, unrelated to the characteristics and concentration of the sediment or to other aspects of the hydraulic behaviour of the sewer, does not properly represent the probability of sewer flows to transport sediment. So I guess what that's saying is perhaps there might be situations where it's lower risk, so you can get away with a slightly slacker gradient or lower self-cleansing velocity, whereas there might be higher risk areas where you want to have higher flow velocities just to make sure there's no problems, which makes sense when you think about it. So in particular, it is known that higher flow velocity is needed to transport a given concentration of sediment in large sewers compared to small. It is also important to appreciate that conditions in gravity sewers are extremely variable. Okay? Flow rates and sediment entering a system can vary considerably with time and location. Therefore, a sewer designed to be self-cleansing in normal conditions is still likely to suffer sediment deposition during periods of low flow or high sediment load. So what that means is really that although you might have self-cleansing velocity for during storm events, there might be long periods where there's no rain or you've not got significant rain, and that leads to a build-up of sediments in the pipe. So we also have to think about how we keep them moving. So sediment transport. So as wastewater flows over a sediment bed in a sewer, the hydraulic lift and drag forces are exerted on the bed particle. Okay? If these two combined forces exceed the restoring force, then entrainment occurs, resulting in the movement of the particles at the flow sediment boundary. Not all particles of a given size at the boundary are dislodged and moved at the same time, as the flow is turbulent, so it's not uniform across the sediment bed, and contains short-term fluctuations in velocity. The limiting condition below which sediment movement is negligible may be set as a critical boundary shear stress or critical erosion velocity. So this is your shear stress here, this parameter here. Now, I'll tell you why this becomes important in a second. So this is a factor which represents the roughness of the pipe, and this is the density of the flow, and V is the velocity. So it's not actually, so what governs whether or not a sediment particle moves isn't the velocity, it's shear stress. Okay, the parameter here, but shear stress is related to velocity, but it's related to velocity squared. Okay, so what that means is that what that means is, whilst velocity is an important parameter, and we use it for our self-cleansing criteria, remember last week's notes, it's not the criteria, and it's shear stress. And shear stress is related to the velocity squared. Okay. Now, one of the things I've always thought is why we speak about velocity rather than shear stress is that velocity is really easy to visualize and we understand it, whereas shear stress is a little bit more abstract for people, and it's harder to think about or visualize what a sufficient shear stress might be. So entrainment. Once sediment has been entrained into the flow, it travels in suspension or as bed load. And we spoke about suspension and bed load in previous slides. Finer, lighter material tends to travel in suspension and is primarily influenced by turbulent fluctuations in the flow, which are in turn influenced by bed shear. Suspended transport is at the mean flow velocity. So the suspended particles tend to move at more or less the same velocity as the flow, which is what you would expect. Heavy material travels by rolling, sliding, or saltating. Saltating just means kind of jumping along the pipe invert or deposited bed as bed load. This type of movement is affected by the local velocity distribution, and advection velocities in this mode are considerably lower than the mean flow velocity. So what this means is that the bed load tends to move slower than the average flow velocity, whereas suspended material moves more or less at it. So the mode of transport a given particle uses or moves under, so whether it's bed load or suspension, depends on the relative magnitude of the lifting effects due to turbulence, as measured by the shear velocity and the settling velocity. Shear velocity is given by, so the settling velocity is, there's lots of different ways of doing these tests, but it's basically you've got your sediment particle in a column of water and you drop it. I've got my pen here. Oh, yeah, you drop it through the column of water, and it's basically how quickly it moves through the column of water. So you would expect, a grit particle to, drop quite rapidly through the column of water, whereas something lightweight like this, it's a sweetie wrapper or something found on my normally tidy desk, if it was to settle through the column of water, I'm not sure it would tend to make its way down quite slowly. So that's really what settling velocity takes into account. There's 101 different ways of measuring it though. So basically, settling velocity and the shear velocity are what determine the mode in which a sediment particle travels through the system, using this equation here. So suspension. Where a sewer has no deposited bed, the presence of sediment in the flow or moving along the bed will cause increased energy losses. So up to 1% of the capacity may be lost. Okay. So what that means is that if you have a pipe with just watering moving along, it goes at a given velocity. If you add sediment to that, the system's having to do a little bit more work by moving those sediments. So, and what that can take, that can lose you up to 1% of the energy in the flow. Geometry. Deposited bed reduces the cross-sectional area to convey a flow. To maintain a given discharge flow velocity, the flow velocity must increase. This becomes important once the sediment bed equals 10% of the pipe diameter. So let's have a think about what that means. So you've got a pipe diameter. Wow. So what you've got is that, so if you've got a sediment bed, so just say you've got a pipe which is running full, because that's the easiest scenario to describe for me right now. You've got a pipe that's running full, and so there's no sediment in it. By adding a sediment bed, you're reducing the cross-sectional area of the pipe. So the only way for the same flow to get through that is for it to move faster. Okay, so you've lost some of your cross-sectional area, so the only way for the same rate of flow to get through that pipe is for it to move faster. Okay, but the issue is that as the flow velocity then moves faster because the sediment's there, that higher flow velocity may then erode the sediment bed, which means the flow velocity can return back to its normal level, which allows deposition to occur, which means that the flow velocity may pick up again, and so you can have a pipe that's in this cycle of deposition erosion and deposition erosion, and that's a sustainable situation. You know, so that's not something to be too worried about. Usually, the greatest influence sediments have on sewer performance is by increasing the bed roughness. So sediment depths of 5% with dunes can reduce the capacity by 10 to 15%. Now, if we look at the picture on the left, this is a beach, and as the tides went out, it's left this dune pattern, so-called, on the beach. And I think we're all familiar with seeing this if you've been to a beach. Now, under certain circumstances in sewer systems, and this is a sewer pipe here on the right, you can also have dunes forming. And now the shape of them is actually quite rough, so the flow needs energy to overcome that roughness, and that means capacity is lost. So those are sort of three things that we really have to think about when we're thinking about sediment transport. So the Syrian method was developed to enable self-cleansing velocity to be specified, which represents a number of factors: pipe size, roughness, flow depth, sediment type, concentration, and the presence of a deposited bed. So the fundamental to the approach are two factors. One, each pipe should be individually designed with its own self-cleansing velocity. Okay. Some deposition is acceptable. Self-cleansing is defined as an efficient self-cleansing sewer is one having a sediment transporting capacity that is sufficient to maintain a balance between the amounts of deposition and erosion, with a time average depth of sediment depth that minimises the combined costs of construction, operation and maintenance. So what that's saying is that over time you might have a sediment bed, but as long as it's within what you consider to be manageable, then you can afford to be quite relaxed about that. The other thing it's saying is that allowing some deposition, so a very small amount of deposition, might be advantageous economically when you consider the alternative is to lay the pipe steeper at greater cost. Okay, so it's about accepting the fact that some deposition under some circumstances may be okay. So it may seem that allowing some deposition would cause reduction in sediment transport capacity. However, lab evidence shows that the presence of a deposited bed actually allows the flow to acquire a greater capacity for transporting sediment in bed. Now this is because, oh my goodness, I don't know what I've done there, let's try over here. No, my hand slipped. So you've got a sediment bed, you've got a pipe swell like this. At the bottom of the pipe, if you've got large sediment particles moving along, I'm not helping with the way I've drawn this, is they're all kind of trying to fight for the space at the bottom of the invert of the pipe. They're all banging against each other because they're all trying to get to the very bottom of the pipe due to gravity. So that means that some energy is lost. But if you had a pipe which had a flat bed because of a sediment bed, the same sediment particles wouldn't be fighting for the bottom, and they would be focusing, if they had minds of their own, they can focus their energy purely on moving forward. Okay, but it's important to note this finding was made under laboratory conditions where you're not looking at the flows, not sewage, it's probably just water, and the sediment particles are quite regular and they're probably inorganic, so it's very controlled. In fact, I think this work, it was uniform sand or spherical particles, I can't remember the detail, but it'll be on vision, I think. So the Sediment method specifies that design should meet 3 criteria. Should be able to transport a minimum amount of suspended solids, transport coarse granular material as bed load, and erode cohesive particles from the sediment bed. So suspended at bed load transport criteria. The assessment of designs is undertaken using laboratory-derived criteria. For criteria 1 and 2, suspended at bed loads transport, separate relationships are developed for transport with and without a deposited bed. So for bed erosion, we have our parameters for bed shear here based on bed roughness. Now, I'm not going to define all these parameters. The point I'm trying to make here is that this was derived in a laboratory. I'm doing my video.
What?
Sorry about that. So this work was derived in the laboratory, and what you end up is quite complex relationships, which do represent quite well the situation which was measured in the laboratory under idealized conditions. But I have a hard think about, a laboratory where you've got a nice round pipe, nice smooth pipe, uniform size particles, nice uniform flows. How does that translate out to the kind of situations we've seen in the sewer videos back in week 1? I think we can have to think about that quite carefully. So here we have it. This is the flow chart for the method. So step 1 is what depth of sediment deposition is allowable. So that's about whether saying you want it to be completely clear or you're going to allow some deposition. Then you have to collect data relating to the sediments you've got in your system, and then also get your hydraulic data, which may be easier to find. Now, collecting data on the sediments in your system, so that's going to involve going into the sewer, looking at the sediments that are there, collecting them, analysing them, and building up some profile of your sediments. That's quite a difficult undertaking, particularly for a system that may not be built yet, and you're trying to estimate the kind of sediments you might have in the system. You've got to review all this data and then look at the 3 criteria. Does it meet the suspended criteria, bed load, and the cohesive sediment erosion? And then based on that, you select a design velocity. So basically, each of these 3 approaches will give you a design velocity, and you pick the highest one for that given pipe. So the application of the method is complex, so I hope you've got that part so far. Well, it's certainly more complex than just having a single velocity for all pipes. Design tables must be produced to represent the application based on catchment-specific data, which is difficult to collect. I've already touched on that. Many of the relationships require detailed data collection. Sorry about my phone making all these noises. Detailed collection. Okay, so you have to, the method you have used properly, you have to collect quite a lot of data so you can try to characterize what's happening. So many of the relationships require detailed data collection. So the bed load transport without deposition equation is here. Okay, so you need to know depths, you need to know the particle sizes, you need to know at which velocity the particles are likely to deposit, at which one they're likely to be eroded. You have to know their specific gravity as well. So that's quite a big undertaking. And again, you look at the complexity of this relationship. This come out of a laboratory where all the data collection is as neat and as tidy as you like, and trying to take those idealized situations and apply them to a real sewer network is not straightforward. There is, however, data in the method which gives you default values which you can adopt. So here, as an alternative, a simplified method is available which relies on typical rather than actual values. So here they are here, and you can see that for grit, it gives you suggested loadings from 10 milligrams per litre to 200, to a D50 of 0.3 of a millimetre up to 0.75. D50 is the medium particle size, and a range of specific gravity as well. So using this data generates this, and this is where we started. So this is a kind of default chart. Now, I'm not aware of anybody, and I hope perhaps I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of anybody who's designed a sewer by going out and collecting the data and generating their own curves or their own design tables based on this method. I think people who have used this method have used the default data to check the velocity. And the reason they've used this method is because it allows them to install pipes at a slacker gradient, therefore lower cost. So, from going to an example, what I would say, and I think this comes, so I'll come back to what I was going to sum up there, but I'll sum up after this example. So there's an example here you could try. So basically, what I want you to do, if you try this example, you've got the IDF plot which I gave you in class 4 to work on it with. And remember, the modified rational method, you're using it exactly the same way. The only difference is the velocity check. So rather than the 1 meter per second, you use the chart which is on the previous slide. Okay. So summing up, I'll read this first, then I'll talk about it a bit. Although the survey method is more complex than using a simple minimum velocity criteria and is based largely on laboratory data, it does attempt to represent the complexity of sediment transport. So what I mean by that is that just set a minimum velocity criteria like we did in class 4 and then forgetting about it doesn't really encourage people to think about actually what's happening inside the pipe network and what they can do to manage the system to perhaps reduce the risks. So it may be that by following through this method, it gets people thinking, well, what are the size of the particles in our system and where are they coming from? And maybe dealing with that is it'll actually help them reduce the risk, arguably more than messing around with minimum velocity criteria. So maybe by looking at this, people might say, actually, we've got pipe networks which are always full with sediment. It costs us lots of money. We could either fix that by, somehow increasing the self-cleansing velocities, or allowing some deposition, or perhaps stopping the sediments from getting to the network by cleaning gully pots out on a more regular basis. So I think that's the attraction method. Not that it's more accurate or more scientific. I think what's good about it is it gets people thinking about what the underlying issues are, and not just setting a minimum velocity, self-cleansing velocity. Okay, so that concludes class 5. You're glad to hear. I'm sorry about the interruptions when I was videoing this, and sorry about my phone making so much noises. It's because my daughter's looking to buy a house, and she's communicating her thoughts on a house we went to look at. So apologies for that. Okay, if you've got any questions about this, I mean the lecture, not the house that my daughter's looking at, please get in touch. Please try the worked example, which is on the previous slide. Post your answers on the Vision discussion forum, and either myself or perhaps even one of the students, I'll give you some feedback on that. Okay, thank you, and I'll see you for class 6, which I'm sure will be very exciting.